Welcome to our very first video explicitly made for our shiny new YouTube channel. I'm Joanna, this is Robert, and on the screen here is the lovely Joy. Just now, I suspect that most people who land here will know either us or Joy, but few will know all of us. So we're Wright History and we do online history courses, and we're delighted to share this space with the fabulous Joy of The Glass of Joy, who does wonderful things with lampwork glass. We met on a course for new businesses and quickly realised that a collaboration of some sort might be fun. We hope you think we were right. And of course, a hat tip to the lovely people at Strive. I'll be putting a link in below. In this video, we're going to be talking about how history and modern practice can inform each other really helpfully. So whether you're into history or glassmaking, we hope this will be of interest to you.
Now, we know that the Vikings got their glass from all sorts of places. Let's just have a look at some here. Old bottles, mosaic pavements, which were often made up of tiny pieces of coloured glass. They put all of these things together and they moulded them into blocks and they transported them to some of the great glassmaking centres of the Viking world in the 9th and 10th centuries. Where do you source your materials from?
Well, it sounds a lot easier than the Vikings had it. I'm really lucky in that we have a fantastic local supplier who's just down the road in Yorkshire. So a lot of my stuff comes as glass rods, them there, so it's ready to use. Some of it comes from our drinks cupboard because bottles are fantastic to reuse. And recently, when I started working with Marmite-glass, I put out calling for recycle because while I love Marmite bottles, I am not a fan of the Marmite.
I am, and I've got a bottle waiting for you. So, next time we see each other in real life, I'll bring it for you.
And I think
fantastic.
We've given an example of all kinds of recycled glass, which just makes me think, is there any kind of glass you can't use?
Technically, probably not, although some of the new safety glasses that have got laminates and stuff in them would be really tricky. The images you can see now on the screen are from a fantastic artist called Hannah Gibson. Hannah molds these little shapes and they're made with things like windscreen glass or screens from iPhones, really odd random stuff, and you get all these amazing and beautiful colours. So technically, pretty much every bit of glass should be able to be reused.
I think I can spot a gin bottle down there in the bottom left.
No, I think the top left is the top one's the gin. That's the Bombay Sapphire,
yes.
isn't it?
Oh yes, it's fancy hand wash, and I know we've got some windscreen glass there, haven't we, as well, as you mentioned. One of the things I've not quite got my head around is what are the practicalities of doing all this? I mean, what temperatures do you need to maintain to get glass into such a state that you can work with it like this? How on earth do you do that?
You need a lot of heat. Some of the glass we melt needs about 1600 degrees Celsius. So if you think a really hot oven is what, 300, 350 maybe, you're going way hotter than that because you've actually got to get the glass molten enough that you can move and shape it. If you try and move it before it's ready, it gets stressed and then it's likely to crack.
Which then gets you stressed.
So that was
lovely.
Yeah. So yeah, you need a lot of heat, but you don't need a lot of heat over the wide area.
Huh.
So you think about if you've seen sort of the traditional glass blowing setup, there's this thing called the glory hole, which is like the big hot thing. I don't work with that. I work with a really little torch, which is a really tiny concentrated flame. So the bit that's in the flame is getting very hot, and you can have your hands within a couple of inches of either side.
Oh, it must have been a bit unnerving the first time you tried that, though, to be sure, wasn't it?
I think, yeah, everybody sort of starts off way out here, and then we get a bit more comfortable, and we work our way in quite a whole lot more.
And I think we've got some examples here of some of the beads you've made. And what strikes me is there's some very similar patterning on these to what we see in Viking beads from places like Coppergate and Birka and Hedeby, etc. The lovely zigzag pattern and the blobs applied. Could you take us through this process?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought actually I'd start by explaining how you get holes into beads, because it's really, once you know, it's really, really obvious. And I suspect the Vikings did it the same way. So in the first picture, they're metal rods and they've got a coating on them, which is a sort of clay. Those metal rods are called mandrels, and that's what defines the size of the hole. So the clay is just there because it stops the glass sticking to the metal. And then once you're ready to take the bead off, it goes into water and the clay softens, and you can then take the bead off. So that's how you get the clay. So to make something like those beads, I'd start with a rod of black glass, and I'd wind, when I say I'd wind it round the mandrel, I would actually go round the mandrel. I keep turning the mandrel constantly. And if you ever go in a lampwork glass classes, all you will hear for your first lesson is keep turning, keep turning, keep turning. Because when the glass is hot enough to get onto the mandrel, it's also hot enough to be susceptible to gravity. So you've got to keep turning to keep everything level. So you start with that and you create your basic black donut. And then this is where it gets really fun. Those lines on those beads that look like wiggles were put on as a straight line that went round the middle of the bead. And then you put yellow dots on one side of the line, and you put black dots on the other side of the line in the gaps between the yellow dots. And as those melt down into the bead, they push the line and they make it wiggle.
That's amazing. Wow.
It's really good fun. So even in something really simple like that, it's not always made the way that you expect it to be made. And I think the same is probably going to be true of a lot of the Viking beads. When you look at them initially, sometimes things that look quite complicated can actually be quite simple to do. But there's some of the sort of swirl beads, and I think you've got a picture somewhere. There's a blue and white one. It looks quite simple. Somebody, that's it. Yeah, somebody has actually had to create that as layers of glass and then swirl it onto the bead, or do one color and then swirl the other color over. So although that, you know, out of everything that's there, that looks like probably the most simple, technically it's not one of the easier ones to do.
That's amazing. And it just shows how little I know. I mean, obviously I know about the artifacts from the Viking period, but it shows how little I know. I thought that were they called mandrels that you said that for making the holes? Mandrels.
Mandrel.
I thought that was an artistic chopstick for one of your website photos, not something practical.
Oh,
that says about me, it does about glass.
You need something you can put into the flame that won't melt.
Of course. Whereas a chopstick would. Yeah.
And a chopstick would. Oddly enough, if you buy those little tiny seed beads, those are made on very fine wire, and then the whole lot is dumped in acid and the wire is dissolved.
Well, I didn't know that.
So that's how they can mass produce those teeny beads. It's not that somebody has sat there working on a micro scale. It's a whole different way.
That's amazing. My role here is obviously just to, show my ignorance, and it might be quicker to say what I do know than what I don't. But one of the things that I remember you and Robert talking about when we first met was something called Mille Fiori. Now, it won't surprise anyone watching this now to know that I hadn't a clue what that was, but I know that you two do. In principle, which of you wants to take what Mille Fiori is in general? You're going to go for this.
Let's have a look at some now. These come from Viking Age Norway, from a place called Iden, and I think they're pretty much typical of Mirafiori. I mean, these are the Rolls Royce, really. Absolutely incredible. I suppose to explain the principle, it's a little bit like how they put the lettering into sticks of rock. You start with a huge clump of glass, and you feed in all sorts of blocks and rods. We're talking about things not looking like they're going to look when you start the process. I mean, this really won't. These will be great clumpy blocks that have been all fitted together, and then they are just drawn out under extreme heat endlessly until these patterns effectively go into miniatures, like little miniature works of art. But the person putting them together had to understand how they would end up looking before starting. I mean, these are absolutely astonishing. I mean, the materials used, again, the really vibrant colors, they will have come out of Roman period mosaic pavements. Other broken glass, they were still making glass in places like the Rhineland during the Viking period. Anything broken, any vessels broken, they'd be boxed up and they'd be sent to the big Viking glass making centers as well. So you've got a combination of all of these things coming together, and the result is absolutely breathtaking. I mean, how long would it take to make something like this today, Joy?
A long time. If you look at the bead in the centre, first of all, the individual marini in that are all fairly simple. So those would be relatively easy to do. So you would start with a rod, you would build colour around it. Quite a few of them, it's maybe 4 or 5 layers. So you could do that pretty quickly. The ones that are really amazing are the ones on the bead next to it that are the black and yellow sections.
Yeah.
And those have literally been created by stacking colours together and then pulling them. So there's going to have been, what have you got? Yellow, black, yellow, black, yellow, black. You've got 9 rods going across and going down. So you've got 81 bits of glass. So they were probably built up in blocks of 3 and then stuck back together and pulled. But there are a couple of things that make that even more extraordinary. When I buy glass, one of the things that makes my life really easy is glass has got a thing called a coefficient of expansion, which is just when you get it hot, it gets bigger, and when you cool it down, it shrinks again. Different glasses have different coefficients of expansion. And if you put them together in the same piece, as they cool, they will pull away from each other and they will crack. Now, when I buy glass, one of the things that manufacturers are really, really keen on is not having that happen because it makes for cross bead makers. But the Vikings didn't have that luxury. They were basically picking up glass from everywhere, and it wasn't designed with what they did with it in mind. You know, you talk about them using Roman tiles. Well, the Romans didn't make those tiles thinking, and these are going to be turned into beads, so we better make sure they work together. That was never a thought. The fact that any of these have survived is astounding. There is an amazing artist called Lauren Stump who does the most fantastic stuff with Marini, and some of his pieces are literally built over years.
Wow.
Because you build sections, and then you pull those sections out, and then that becomes a smaller bit that goes into another bigger picture and another bigger picture, and so on. So you can basically keep going.
Wow. And we'll see if we can find a link to put below for that as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's actually something that if you want to have a shot at home, if you've got some plasticine or something similar, you can have a go. And you can literally start by building a tube of colour, putting stripes down the side, putting another colour around the outside, and then roll it out like we used to do making plasticine worms when we were kids.
All of mine
the same thing.
All of mine just turned up sludge brown.
Tell you what, it sounds like the safer option for a novice, doesn't it? Which I suppose brings us to the question, I mean, what are the safety issues when you're working like this?
The really obvious one, you're working with something hot and you're working with something that you can't touch. One of the really nasty things about glass is hot glass looks like cool glass very, very quickly. So one of the first things you learn when you're learning to make glass beads is that you always sit the hot ends of your glass rods away from you so you don't pick them up by mistake, because glass holds heat for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So obviously there were risks about burns, and I would imagine that the Vikings didn't have the luxury of, you know, a torch with a nice little gas cylinder and an oxygen concentrator. So I would imagine that their setup was probably quite a lot dodgier. They were probably working with a much bigger fire just to get the heat that they needed. The other two things that kind of come up in terms of safety, one is eye protection, because when you melt glass in a flame, you get a lot of flare. If you've ever seen anybody glass blowing, or you've watched anybody make glass beads, you actually can't really see what they're doing because there's so much flare.
Yeah.
We get around that by wearing special glasses that cut the flare out. But again, I'm guessing the Vikings couldn't ring up my local glass supplier and go, pair of these, please.
I don't think they found any today.
No. Funnily enough, glass blowers' cataracts was historically a thing, where the brightness from either looking into the glory hole or constantly looking at a flame meant that people developed cataracts over time. And it was a sort of known, you know, if you worked down a mine, you got dodgy lungs. If you worked making glass, you went blind.
Wow.
Yeah. Take your pick.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the last thing, which again was probably less of an issue for the Vikings because they probably weren't working in a well-insulated, not so well-ventilated building, was toxic fumes. Because to give glass different colours, you put different chemicals into it. And as you heat it back up, these chemicals give off gases, and some of them aren't terribly pleasant. So I work with a vent system, much like the hood in your over your oven in your kitchen. So it's constantly pulling fumes away. If the Vikings were working outside, they didn't have that issue. But what it did mean was if they got a gust of wind or anything like that, that hot glass that they were working with was going to get thermal shocked, and it was probably going to break.
Oh, goodness.
So, yeah, they didn't have it easy.
In so many ways.
I mean, when you describe all of that, it's a wonder any of these things have survived at all. They're so fragile. So many things can go wrong. So many different tolerances and that sort of thing. It's just amazing how they've survived all this length of time.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. One of the things that's interesting when you look at the shapes of these beads is the ones that have survived and have survived well tend to be more or less round. And that's clever. Glass is really, really simple stuff. If you heat glass up, it wants to be round. In fact, if you heated glass up somewhere there was no gravity, it would form a perfect sphere. So glass knows what it wants to be in life. It's not, you know, it's not like us that sort of has midlife crises and thinks, what should we be doing now? Glass, in a lot of ways, glass is really simple. It knows what it wants to be. Where you run into problems is where you want it to be something else. So the beads that I showed you earlier, if I hold those up, if you look at those, yeah, see how in the top there's a curve. If I do that on one of these, yeah. So that curves, it's a sort of donut shape.
Yeah.
So there are no sharp corners, there are no hard edges. No. It's kind of letting the glass be the shape it wants to be. It's really happy being that shape.
Yeah.
So that makes it really, really strong. So you could bounce one of these off a concrete floor. It would be absolutely fine. And I do that quite often. Where things get a bit more interesting is if you have something like this, glass links, an individual link is really, really strong because the ends have been melted together, so it's one piece of glass.
Right.
So I could take that one link, I could drop it on the floor, it would be fine. But if you drop the whole necklace, it's going to possibly break because the bits will bounce off each other and they can't get out of each other's way.
Yeah, yeah.
And as a final sort of example of something that probably isn't going to survive quite so well, you have glass decorations.
Oh, those are lovely Christmas icicles, right?
Yeah.
You can bang off each other, and they're not super fragile, but they're not the kind of thing they're going to get dug up because they're long and they're narrow. So they're really vulnerable to pressure at any point of them, making them snap.
Huh.
So it's almost a bit like the opposite of that Archimedes, give me a lever long enough and I'll move the world. Give me a bit of glass long enough and it's gonna break.
Nice.
So, sorry.
No, it's just for me. It's just breathtaking. There's so many things there. I mean, I didn't know this. No, I mean,
No.
but the skill they must have had in the 9th and 10th century to be able to work these things out. I mean, it's certainly, I don't know about you, it's brought that into much sharper
Really
focus.
has, yeah.
And of course, today we're thinking about issues like recycling, sustainability. Well, they were all into that back then, weren't they?
Absolutely. And it's sort of mind-blowing to kind of think things that are being made now in glass are going to be about probably in tens of thousands of years' time. So in a way, there's a real moral imperative to not make rubbish, because it's going to still be there. It's not going to be doing anything awful. It's not like plastics that split off and do dodgy things. It'll just sit there. But it's possible that in thousands of years' time, somebody could be digging something up that was made today, and it'll still look
a Marmite jar necklace, in fact. Yes.
You might, yeah. It might well get dug up.
And how would historians of the future interpret that? That's maybe the story for another video at some point.
I suppose as well that, when you look at the Viking beads that have survived, they were incredibly precious to people.
Yes.
There wasn't a throwaway culture around things, and the amount of skill and care and time that went into making these meant that people looked after them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I guess that's why
they were used as currency. So I mean, they were just intrinsically valuable things, precious things that you would wear about your person. You pass them down as heirlooms. You treasure them. No, you wouldn't think of throwing them away. So quite a contrast with our disposable culture that we got today, where if it's last year's, we're not interested anymore, move on, what's next, etc. It really wasn't like that.
Well, having said that, you're making future heirlooms, aren't you, effectively?
That's very much the plan, that there'll be things that you'll have and then they'll go on to somebody else. But the nice thing about glass for me is you can recycle it. So anything that we make, we can recycle it into something else, or if it gets broken, it can be mended.
Yes. And do we do that? Yes. We've had to mend one chain, which came to us with a bit of a story. The lady who had it had left it on her kitchen counter. Her cat knocked it onto the floor. She had 2 Jack Russells, which fought over it, dragged it through the house, dragged it out to the garden, and eventually one link broke. So glass is not fragile. Yeah.
That's not bad.
That's not bad at all. But yeah, it came back with a very apologetic note saying it had somewhat been through the wars. And it's that thing that properly made glass is really strong.
Yeah.
But actually, backtracking slightly to the Viking skill levels again, if you look on any modern glassmaker's website, we talk endlessly about our glass is annealed to take the stress out. And what that means is when we've finished, it goes into a kiln that's digitally controlled. So it sits at certain temperatures. So you take it up to the point that the glass can relax, and all the strain that you've put into it as you've twisted it and turned it and mashed it and whatever, that all relaxes out. And then you cool it down really gently. Because if you don't, what happens is the outside of the bead is getting cooler and shrinking, and the inside of the bead is still hot and it isn't shrinking. and things crack.
Yeah. Yeah.
By annealing, you pull all of that stress out and you make things that last for so much longer. So what I assume the Vikings had to do was basically flame anneal. So once they'd finished making stuff, somebody had to stand there for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, literally cooling this thing by very gently heating the outside and then letting that heat soak in a little bit. And in the meantime, the heat from the inside of the bead was coming out. So you're leveling out the temperature across the whole bead until you get to a point that you can put it in something to let it cool down. So when you see some of those beads that have been made and have survived, the skill level in those is just phenomenal. Not just the skill to make that bead, but the skill to manage those materials.
Amazing. Now might be a good point to switch on to the image of the Viking bracelet.
Absolutely. Let me just...
or the Joy version there.
Yes, because we've got this wonderful
so
thing.
Yeah. And so that, I guess, is illustrating what you were saying about how it's got the... I'm waffling. I'll shut up.
Why don't you take us through it, Joey?
One of the things with this was when I looked at the Viking beads and the images that you showed me, a lot of the decoration on them is done by cutting. There is colour and there's a lot of colour, but there is also a lot of texture.
Yeah.
So just as a sort of way of demoing a couple of different things, you've got the bead to the far left and the bead 2 in from that. They are both made by making a basic bead with single colour of glass and then with a knife just pressing lines into it. That's how those ridges are created.
Wow.
The one in the end is done the super modern way with a thing called a bead roller, which is a graphite mold. So you get your glass onto your mandrel and then you use the marver to actually do some of your shaping. The disc bead is there really because you don't see a lot of those in the Viking beads, and that's because structurally it's a less sound shape. When you come up towards the edges, it's a bit more fragile. And I would guess that when I look at Viking beads, all of them are shapes that you could shape with gravity. So you get the mandrel, you get it hot, you keep turning, and gravity sorts out your shape for you. That one there, you could do it with gravity, but you'd be there for a really, really long time.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk us through some of the aspects that wouldn't have occurred to us in a million years. We've certainly found it fascinating, and we look forward to much more talking about sharing our respective Viking and or glass interests. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Joy, and we will post appropriate links below